Thank you for joining us today for the Raising Cultural Awareness training. My name is Monica Yellow Owl. I am currently the Behavioral Health Manager for Klamath Tribal Health and Family Services, Youth and Family Guidance Center. We're here today in this room together to address health equity. And this training really lives out of some work that was done through Oregon Health Authority and what is called the Mental Health Investments. We began a journey of looking into health equity and how where we live affects our health. Part of this work is helping the broader community understand that the Indigenous population that lives here, what our story is, and what our narrative is. So thank you for joining us today on this journey. I have an agenda for our time together today. Number one, to enhance the meaning of cultural awareness. Maybe you have taken other cultural awareness trainings, equity trainings, and so forth, but this one is going to enhance your knowledge, your specific knowledge around the Klamath, Modoc, and Yahuskin people's history right here in the Klamath Basin. So we're going to do somewhat of a dive into history, both pre and post contact. Secondly, I hope to spark your curiosity. You may hear things in this training that challenge or go against maybe what you have learned in Western education systems, or if you've grown up in this community your entire life or your family has also been here for multiple generations, you may have a particular narrative about the tribe. And so I really want to help you understand that part of this training will spark your curiosity, and that actually is an agenda. 3, I want to take a look into, and what I'm actually going to call a peek into historical trauma from a behavioral health lens. And the reason why I say peek is because it is nearly impossible to condense 170 years of historical trauma into a 2-hour training. So we're just going to pull the curtain back and we're going to take a peek in there to see what the historical trauma impacts have been from a behavioral health lens. Next, my goal in agenda is to diminish single narrative. So those of us who are raised in education systems, learned from school books, maybe learned from dominant narrative in our society, we have really a single narrative of how we look at Indigenous people, how we look at the Klamath tribes. And today I'm going to diminish that because the narrative today is from the Indigenous perspective. It is not from a Western perspective. Next, I would like to pinpoint the Klamath tribe's location from a behavioral health lens in present day. So not only talking about history, but talking about present. And lastly, introducing a Klamath Modoc word or term, sayuktigi. And sayuktigi is an ancient word that means way beyond. And that is where I would like your thoughts to go today, where I'll be taking your thoughts throughout this time together, is beyond what you've known, beyond what you've heard, thought, or felt. And I'm going to ask that you presently and intently go there with me today throughout this training. One of the terms that I like to introduce right from the beginning is a term called time immemorial. And if you have read any newspaper articles or you have watched any presentations from our tribal leadership or other tribal nations across the country, you may have heard this phrase. And time immemorial is a phrase meaning time extending beyond the reach of memory, record, or tradition, indefinitely ancient, ancient beyond memory or record. Furthermore, in law, it means that property or benefit has been enjoyed for so long that its owner does not have to prove how they came to own it. And in English law and its derivatives, time immemorial means the same as time out of mind, time before legal history, and beyond legal memory. And I will return back to time immemorial shortly, but I like to introduce this training with that phrase time immemorial and help you further understand as we move through our time together what that actually means to the local Indigenous population. Secondly, another important terminology for you to understand is tribal sovereignty. Tribal sovereignty in its actual definition is the authority of an independent political entity and inherent. So we were sovereign nations living and thriving before any foot was set onto this continent. Present day, there are over 560 federally recognized American Indian Alaska Native tribes living within the United States of America, with over half of those being in the Alaskan Territory. What tribal sovereignty really means is that we have a direct government to government relationship. The United States Constitution, for example, Article 4(2) treaties, state that treaties with Native American tribes are the supreme law of the land. That is huge. That is no minor detail. So, as a sovereign tribal nation, as a sovereign tribal government, we are then able to conduct our own elections, determine our own citizenship, like our enrollment criteria, and consult directly with the United States government on policy, regulations, legislations, and funding. So one real-time example of sovereignty is enrollment. So I am an enrolled member of a federally recognized tribe. And when I was born, I was not automatically a member of a federally recognized tribe. Because my tribe has enrollment criteria, my parents then had to prove that I could meet the enrollment criteria of my tribe. What that included was an extensive family tree and mathematics around what type of blood quantum I have to prove my Indian blood. Blood quantum is a very big topic in Indian country across the nation, and every tribe has the authority to determine what their blood criteria will be for enrollment. Some tribes are 1/16 Indian blood. Some tribes are an eighth, some are a quarter, some are half. It's really up to the tribes and how they want to determine their own citizenship. So that's one point that I want you to take away with is you're not automatically born into a tribe and enrolled in that tribe. We have specific criteria to do so. I want to also just remind you that what you just learned is that we have a treaty with the United States of America. So we have a United States of America to Klamath Tribes government to government relationship. I'm going to introduce some prehistory before contact, before the world began to come what you know of it to be today. Currently, this territory that you are living in within Klamath County was once only inhabited by the Klamath, the Modoc, and the Yehuskin Paiute Indians. We lovingly refer to ourselves as the Numu or the Mukluks, and in our sacred languages, those terms mean the people. We are very distinct nations. Every single one of our tribal nations, Klamath, Modoc, or Yehuskin, has our own creation story, the story that tells about how our people were made. You might be familiar with organized religion or secular religion beliefs about how a God created a world in 7 days. On the seventh day, he rested. How a rib was taken from a man to create a woman. Those kinds of stories we also have in our history, in our sacred narratives that tell us how we came to be. For example, the Klamath people have a beautiful story about their creator, Gumukamsh, and the relationship that he had with his daughter, the evening sky, and how together they went to the world of the ancient people. And he brought back bones and placed them at several locations across the landscape, and those people became the Mukluk people. If you travel south to another tribal territory, they will have a unique story about how their world was created by the silver fox. And so, although we can stand in Klamath territory, Modoc territory, Pit River territory, Shasta territory, Wintu territory, and we have this collective cornerstone that we are all connected to, and I will use Mount Shasta as the example. Although it would only take us historically, a few days to walk to each other's homeland, And we all, from vantage points in our own territory, can see Mount Shasta. We all had this very unique belief of how our people came to be, vastly different from tribal nation to tribal nation. In addition to that, we had ancient stories that told us who we are, why we are where we are, why that particular mountain is the way it is, where it is, what mountains hold sacred power, where do we go for our healing, what plants were given to us by our Creator to doctor ourselves. We had our own language, our own customs, our own land base and territory, and we were born with absolute inherent birthrights to maintain those customs and those traditions, those stories, and that connection to our spiritual world and our physical world. So today in 2022, in just 7 generations of time, prior to the founding of the state of Oregon, there were 43 unique and vibrant tribes thriving in Oregon, in what would become Oregon. And if you fast forward to 2022, there are only 9 federally recognized tribes existing in what is now known as the state of Oregon. And so if you consider just for a second the depth of loss in 7 generations' time, from pre-contact, knowing your territory, thriving in your territory, your sacred narratives really being the foundation of who you are to become, that inherent birthright as an Indigenous person, to some of these tribes are completely gone. And so that's really something to consider. I think right from the gate of this training is, how do we begin to measure the depth of loss? What is the mathematical equation what is the mathematical equation that can compute to how much loss has occurred? I'm going to get into the Klamath Tribes history. When I say Klamath Tribes, what I'm really referring to is 3 distinct nations, the Klamath, the Modoc, and the Huascan people. And I will talk later in this presentation about how those all came under one umbrella. But I will be moving to 1825. In 1825, for the Klamath territory, in our history books, will mark the period of first contact. And first contact was held by the Hudson Bay Company, which was operated by both Thomas Mackay and Peter Skeen Ogden. In our history books, it'll tell about the travels of these individuals making their way through the Pacific Northwest, prized fur trappers, leading an expedition for skins, in particular the beaver pelts. And they would find themselves in Klamath territory. One interesting fact about the Hudson Bay Company is both of these individuals spoke what's called a Chinook jargon. And the Chinook jargon was a very unique trading language. What the Chinook jargon is it's a trading language that many of the tribes in the Pacific Northwest spoke. It was a way that we could travel to our neighboring tribe and have this trade and economy with one another, and we had a language that we used in order to do that. So Thomas Mackay and Peter Skeen Ogden both were very functional with that language. So when they came into the territory with a very small party, they could conversate with the local Indigenous people. At particular times, they found themselves in some very peculiar situations due to weather, lack of food, and were rescued and assisted by the local tribal population in their time here. And they wrote about uh, the landscape, they wrote about the riverways, they wrote about the abundance of waterfowl and animals, but they didn't write about the territory in such a way that maybe the history books talk about Christopher Columbus or any other discoverer that comes into the territory, that this is ripe for taking. They didn't speak about our land base in that way, but encroachment to this point had already been felt. As we are trading with the neighbors, we are beginning to see different types of tools, different types of cookware, clothing. We're beginning to hear stories about a race unlike ourselves that are coming into the territory. Also, encroachment is starting to be felt by the Modocs in particular, and at the southern end of their territory, they begin to see settlers coming through the southern end of their territory, heading for places like San Francisco, Wairika, those kinds of areas, making their way to the Willamette Valley and such. It's really important to point out that in 1825, we are one of the last tribal territories to have contact. One of the reasons for that would be we live in this natural fortress of a basin that we're surrounded by really large mountainous ranges that in those days, winters would have been very real, and the snowpack would have been very deep in the mountains. And so if you came down into the Klamath Basin, you had a short window to get out and to get in. And so we had this beautiful natural fortress designed and developed by our creator to protect us, and being one of the last tribes to have contact. After Thomas McKay and Peter Skeen Ogden left the territory, there would be an introduction of territory to other interests. And one very, very important vantage point is up until this point, we have no knowledge that from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast, tribes have gone through genocide. They've gone through Indian wars. They've gone through disease. They've gone through treaty negotiations, and many of them are conquered and now living on reservations. Also, at this time, we have no knowledge. When we have our first contact, we have no knowledge that Washington, D.C. is now a vibrant, bustling city. That train tracks are being crisscrossed all across America. That Chicago is a city, that San Francisco is quickly becoming a city. So we don't have knowledge of this yet. We're still living very much in an indigenous fashion. So the next expedition to come into the territory would be the Fremont expedition in 1844. And the Fremont expedition comes in with purpose. You know, they have been busy working all the way up and down the Pacific Northwest, down into California, really creating these large routes, carving out large trails and entryways for settlers to come into the territories. And they are fueled by manifest destiny. They are fueled by that secular religious belief that this land was created for them, that it was meant to be discovered, it was meant to be conquered. At this time, a lot of things are happening for the indigenous population. The U.S. War Department issues a decree and permits the Fremont expedition with orders to kill on sight for indigenous people that they come across. So there is a very different vibe with the Fremont expedition, and they come in with a massively large party. Later on, they would be joined by John C. Fremont. Oh, no, sorry. Later on, they would be joined by Kit Carson. And as they're moving through the territory, there really is no regard for indigenous way of living. It is a completely different experience than what we had with Peter Skeen Ogden and Thomas McKay when they came to the area. And so during the height of the tension during that time in Klamath territory, we would have the first massacre occur at Dokdokawas in 1846. And so what we begin to see here in full force is a race of people with different value sets. They were operating through orders for the purpose of settling territory. And On the receiving end of this, we're starting to recognize warfare in a manner that we've never seen it, weaponry that we've never seen, a savagery of killing that is foreign to us. And so during this time, it's really a challenging time for the Klamath Modoc and Yuhuskin people, because just in the first 15 years of contact, there is already an immense amount of change happening, challenge happening, aggressive and assertiveness entry into our territory is happening, and it's a very confusing time. And so we're going to fast forward to the 1840s to the 1850s. And during this period of time, Oregon is not yet a state and California is brand new. And in the 1849 California State of Address, it is stated in the State of Address that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct. And so California has a number of measures across the board that they are using to charge into and eradicate pockets of indigenous people. Modoc people are now living under the rule of California. So it's a really difficult time for our California indigenous people. There is now a stream of settlers coming through Modoc territory, heading for the gold rush, heading for those areas that are already marked for settlement. And they begin to increase in numbers rapidly. And during this time, the smallpox epidemic reaches the Modoc people. And they say that at the height of their population, there was roughly about 1,000 to 1,500 Modocs living at that time between two very large village sites. And in the course of the smallpox epidemic that was introduced just within the first 15 years of contact, it depletes the Modoc population by about 20%. I want to take and reflect what a smallpox epidemic would cause. Not only death, but this is really like the hardcore impact to our cultural ways. Our sacred narratives, our connection to our Creator, our spiritual way of life has helped us to understand how to see the changing of worlds when our people walk off of this world and they're traveling to the afterlife. So we have these sacred narratives that tell us when a death occurs, this is what you are to do. These are the very strict cultural protocols that you will follow. You build a sweat lodge, you use these many stones, you cut your hair, you mourn in this fashion, you sing these songs, you refrain from eating these particular foods. And in order to do those things, you need time, you need ability to travel, you need to get ready for ceremony, you need to have your practices fluid and moving at all times, access to your sacred medicines. All of these things would be required. In order to get our people through the first 5 days of the death, and in that 5 days they're traveling, this is what our sacred narratives tell us, is that our people are traveling to the spirit land over the course of 5 days. And what we do in our physical world is really important in helping them to achieve that. But how do we keep up with this amount of loss? 20% of that population is roughly going to be anywhere from 250 to 400 people in a very short amount of time. So we have to begin to pick and choose pieces of our ceremonies. And so what does this begin to do to the richness and the fidelity of cultural practices we've been using for thousands of years? But these are also very beneficial to our mental health, because the processing of grief through cultural practices is huge. It's how we've been able to get over historically droughts and periods of famine and the eruption of Crater Lake and the amount of lives that would have been lost in the eruption of Crater Lake. You know, these cultural practices are extremely important to our people, but we are now seeing an exceedingly heavy impact on those spiritual customs. Also, smallpox is not a disease that you get on Monday and then you're deceased by Friday. So there is long suffering of families here. And, we have no immunity at all for something like smallpox. So the first people to go are our elder population, our small children. So we're losing wisdom keepers in a really tragic way. So we have the introduction of grief. We have the introduction of complicated grief. You lose a loved one, you're working through that loss, and you have the loss of another one. And you're trying to work through two, and you have a third, and you're trying to work through three, and now you have a fourth. And so, complicated grief is introduced. Those things, when untreated, can lead to depression. Mass suffering can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder, what we also know fondly today as post-colonial stress disorder. And so it's hard times just within the first 15 years, especially for the Modoc people. And what we know today in the behavioral health world is PTSD has triggers. You can develop a fight or flight or fear response to trauma, to the triggering of trauma. And as settlers begin to increase into the territory of the Modoc people, they are beginning to act with what we would know in this day and age as trauma response. They are fighting, they are fleeing, they are fighting, they are freezing. And this is very difficult for the Modoc people. At the height of this tension, when 20% of the population has perished and everybody has untreated mental illness, California has another tactic to try to get the Modoc people under control. They hire Ben Wright, who is a prized Indian fighter with hundreds, if not thousands, of kills under his belt. And they charge Ben Wright to come into the Modoc territory to gather the Modocs and bring them under a white flag of truce. And they plan a large-scale feast for the Modoc people and attempt to poison their food with strychnine. And when that is unsuccessful, Ben Wright and his posse sneak into a village near present-day Merrill, Oregon, and they open fire on that village site, killing another 40 Modocs in one fell swoop. And at this point in time, we also don't have knowledge that there are telegraph wires crisscrossing the United States of America. That there has already been, for well over 200 years, a narrative being written about Indigenous people and how savage they are and calculating they are. But really, when we stand back and look at it from a behavioral health perspective, they were reeling from mental health conditions brought on by war, brought on by massacre, brought on by death and disease and destruction and loss of cultural ways. And so that single narrative is really a hit. And it's really working well for the foundation of the United States of America. And so what the single narrative begins to be told about the Modoc people in particular is those bloodthirsty savages. They are robbing settlers. They are killing innocent people who only want to come to this territory to settle. But really, it's that fight, flight, freeze response that they are having because they have just been through horrific amounts of tragedy. And so we're going to fast forward to 1864. Now, this is only 38 years since first contact. A couple of things that I want to point out in this particular time is that there is no formal education that has been given to Klamath, Modoc, or Yahuskin people. We've still been living in this very chaotic world. Oregon is not yet a state, and things are very tense between settlers coming into the territory and the indigenous people. And so what this is causing is the United States of America to really look at coming in, bringing a treaty negotiation team into the territory to get these tribes under control, to get them into a treaty. And so in 1864, they dispatch a group from Washington, D.C. to come into the territory to discuss treaty negotiations. And these negotiations would take place just south of what we know as Fort Klamath today, in an area which is called Council Grove. Loss of land, however, was already felt. The Klamath Basin was largely becoming settled. Tribal people were already seeing a heavy restriction to food that they accessed every year for thousands of years. They were already seeing that they could not access sources and sites that were necessary for healing, gathering medicines, going to particular spiritual and power places. They were already seeing that they were being restricted from these places. And so in the treaty negotiations, the Modocs and the Yahuskin Paiutes are already learning as they're coming to the negotiation table. They are already learning that they are going to lose their land altogether, and that there would be a reservation considered only in Klamath territory. And so in this 8-day process, thousands of Indians are gathered at Council Grove. And at this point in time, we have no knowledge of English language, no knowledge of mathematics, no knowledge of what an acre is, how maps are drawn, how topography is considered. We're just naming landmarks and negotiating landmarks. And at the end of this treaty, the Klamath people are ceding 20 million acres of land, and the Modocs and the Yahuskins lose their land base altogether. That leaves 2.2 million acres reserved for what would become the Klamath Reservation. So let's go back to that thought about how do you measure this amount of loss? What is the dollar amount that would make this type of land exchange fair? What is the mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional impact on Indigenous people who just lost their land entirely? So those mountains that you depend on to carry your children through puberty stages, when your doctors have been going to power places to call on the spirits to treat your people, you can't access those anymore. Your traditional foods are gone. Let's think for a second about the impact, the collective impact that all of those changes will have. In addition, the immense amount of social changes that are happening rapidly. So intermarriage, blood quantums changing, that our Indian doctors are now losing all of their rights to practice. It's illegal. Another thing that happens on the reservation, and this is by design, is that the United States of America is developing reservations specifically to create a dependence on the federal government. And so where we once roamed and saw our own food sources seasonally, We were traveling on foot 40, 50 miles a season to gather and harvest our traditional foods. We were making all of our own clothing. Now you line up in a food for government issued food rations. Now you line up in a food for blankets. We will tell you where you are going to live within the Klamath Reservation boundaries. The treaty later is ratified in 1872, so the first 8 years of this treaty being signed is chaotic. Funds do not come as promised. Starvation is happening. Lack of resources is causing people to freeze in the winters and not get the provisions that were promised to them. There is no medical happening. There is no school yet happening on this reservation. And one detail is important to consider here, and that's in the actual signing of the treaty itself. And if you are ever able to see a copy of this treaty, you will see that our leaders who signed were only shown how to mark an X on the paper with a black ink quill pen. That's because we had no knowledge of even how to translate our Indian names into the English alphabet. Yet we were signing a treaty largely written in very scriptive English font, speaking about our homeland and our territory and what we were standing to lose. And so after 8 years, that treaty gets ratified, meaning that in Washington, D.C., they are creating the maps. In Washington, D.C., they are fine-tuning the pointing out of landmarks. And nobody is there from the Klamath, Modoc, or Yahuskin people to watch this process, to make sure that there is fairness and equity and truth and justice in the process. So hundreds of thousands of acres can be shaved off of the ratified treaty boundary markings with no way to advocate or understand that process. That's one really important fact to point out. And this is only 38 years of first contact. So we went from living a very pre-contact indigenous way of living, and in 38 years losing extremely amount in 38 years losing the majority of our entire land base collectively between the three tribes. As I stated before, that first 8 years on the reservation was really hard because the funding was coming in late. The funding was not enough to manage the size of the Klamath Indian Reservation. There were tensions between the three tribes themselves. And so this is also where we're seeing the birth of lateral oppression, where we would normally think maybe that people who have shared trauma, people who are collectively being coerced and oppressed, would band together. What we're quickly learning at this period of time is that we are losing, and we are losing at a really fast rate. And so we need to become territorial within of what we have within our control. And so that changes also the social dynamics on the reservation. The Klamath Tribes is the most populated of the three tribes, so there becomes this natural hierarchy on the reservation. And Modocs, they begin self-advocacy. You know, they are petitioning the Klamath Indian Agency. They are saying, we are not getting our rations. You know, our people are freezing in the winter, and this is not what we gave up our homeland for. You can go back and look at historical records that show how they came into the agency. They were fully advocating for these things, their due rights through the treaty, and those continually fell on deaf ears. And so in April of 1870, under the leadership of Captain Jack, also known as Kientapus, 371 Modocs living at Modoc Point decided to leave the Klamath Reservation and return to their homeland. And in 8 years' time, the landscape has changed. And when they begin flourishing back down into the Merrill, Malin, Tule Lake area, what they are seeing is large-scale settlement. Where there was once a thriving, vibrant river, there are now cattle, there are fences, there are ranches. They have even more restricted access to their food sources, their waterways. And this is tense time for the Modoc people. And this raises the awareness of the United States military and the United States government in that they cannot have this. They cannot have any more Indian uprisings. So they dispatch the army to go get the Modocs and return them to the Klamath Indian Reservation at all costs. And so that time from April of 1870 to November of 1872, was a very peculiar time for the Modoc people attempting to reestablish themselves in their own homeland, to try to live alongside and under the shadow of settlers now living in the territory and having full control of their land. And so much is changing for their world during this time. November 28th of 1872 is the eruption of the Modoc War through an incident that occurred when the U.S. military came into and was going to ambush a Modoc village. And from that point on, the Modocs were engulfed in full-scale war. And this war is not a war that was only fought between men. This was a war that also took in pregnant mothers, elderly, small children, were alongside their parents in what we know today as the stronghold. And many negotiations were attempted between the Modoc people and the U.S. military. And at the height of that, they're saying, just leave us in the rocks. Nobody wants the rocks. Just leave us in the rocks and we will figure it out. But that is not going to fly for the United States government, who's now engulfed in this war. At the height of the Modoc War, they say there was about 50 Modoc men fighting against 1,500 military soldiers. And as the war began to come to an end and Modocs were relinquishing their arms and turning themselves in, it was desperate times for Captain Jack and the remaining Modocs who continued to flee and fight for their right to live within their own ancestral homeland. And in the end, Captain Jack and the remaining Modocs would be captured and forced marched to Fort Klamath. And they would arrive in July. And in July, the remaining Modocs would be put into a stockade, and the leaders would be put into jail at Fort Klamath, shackled and put into jail cells. And so this time is a period of heavy confusion. There are reporters that were on site, allowed to be on site at Fort Klamath during the height of the trial. And they were detailing nearly minute by minute of all of the happenings that were transpiring. They were dictating all of the notes from the trial itself, but also what was the mood of the people. What was happening to the remaining indigenous people of this territory. And they talked heavily about, in their writings, about the affect of the Modoc people in particular. The flat affect, the gaunt faces, the destitute nature that they were in. And from a behavioral health lens, we look at that as mass group trauma. We look at that as genocide, the impacts and effects of genocide. And so the introduction of things like institutional racism, the gallows that they would hang the leaders from eventually were already being built before the trial even commenced. So what does this reinforce to the people about justice, about fairness, about equity? There is one beautiful story that exists about uh, the United States military posted at Fort Klamath allowed for Captain Jack to come into the stockade and see his family for the first time since July, and it's now October. And as they're entering the stockade, the reporters are documenting what they're witnessing with their eyes, and they talk about the quietness that occurred at that moment, that nobody showed any emotion to their leader except one person, and that was his daughter Rosie. And when she saw her dad, she squealed with joy and ran up and jumped in his arms, and he sat on a crate and rocked her for the duration of 10 minutes that he was allowed. And when it was time to go, he let her off of his lap and was let out. And they closed the doors, the large wooden doors to the stockade, and then there was this eruption of wailing that occurred. And even in the midst of trauma, the reverence that they showed in that moment for their leader was profound. The amount of respect that they held for him as their leader was profound. There would only be 155 remaining Modocs at this period of time, so 81% of their population was decimated in the first 46 years of contact. At the end of trial, they would hang the Modoc leaders for war crimes committed against the United States of America, in particular because this is the only Indian war in which a general was killed, and it was the most expensive Indian war that happened, just to round up a small band of Modocs out of a bed of lava rocks and make a point out of Indian resistance. And the reporters will also talk about how it was required that every remaining Indian watch the hanging of these leaders. And so this whole promenade happens, this parading of their hanging site. You know, bands are playing and people are flooding in from counties all over. A millionaire travels all the way across the United States, to watch this go on, because this is big news across the papers in America, especially because a general's life was lost during this time. And the reporters, they are writing minute by minute of what's occurring in the final moments of the leaders' lives. And they talk about how they were brought out onto a wagon and they were taken to the scaffolding to be hung. And they were brought up one by one, and the rope was placed over their neck and the hood over their face. And as the handkerchief dropped and they swung the axe that cut the rope and the leaders fell to their death, the reporters wrote about a wave of anguish that swept over the people at that time, and they literally collapsed to the ground. And in our behavioral health world, we see these things as what's called like a mental break. Like your mind cannot take one more incident of trauma that it just shuts down. And as they're wailing and weeping and exhausted from trauma, their leaders are being cut down. Hair is being cut off of their heads and auctioned off on site. A gavel is cut out of the scaffolding that would later be used to proceed court hearings in the territory. And the leaders are taken to a medical army tent where their heads are severed and sent off for study. And 8 days later, the remaining Modocs at the site would be loaded onto wagons and shipped to Reading and put on a rail car and exiled to Oklahoma. So that is the government taking care of the Modoc problem, is alienating them entirely from their homelands. So after this period of time, there would only be one more Indian war in the Indian War era of the history of the United States, and that would be the Nez Perce War with Chief Joseph. And once the Nez Perce War was over, that was the end of Indian wars for the purpose of conquer, the purpose of relinquishing their land bases. And so now the government is starting to recognize that they have a new problem. because America is all about advancement. America is all about finance and education and the next biggest, greatest thing. And they have reservations full of dependent indigenous people by design, by the government's design, still very much wanting to speak their language, practice their customs, raise their children using thousands of years old of ancient parenting techniques. They still want to gather and eat their traditional foods, but this is a problem for the United States. They're beginning to see this as a problem. So with the Indian Wars over, you have high-level people in administration who are now looking at this problem. One of those being Colonel Henry Pratt. He petitions the federal government with this idea for assimilation schools. And his mantra was, all the Indian there is in a race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man. And that becomes the proclamation for what would be known as assimilation schools. And the government loves the idea. And they quickly and loosely fund the upspring of assimilation schools across the United States. So 357 boarding schools, military-run boarding schools, popped up all over the United States. 8 here, right in Oregon. 50% of those churches would be, or 50% of those boarding schools would be run by religious groups. So the interesting thing here is there's not a lot of oversight. They're very loosely funded. And so these children become property, no longer seen as unique individuals with inherent birthrights to be who they are. They are seen as property of the United States of America. Now, in 2022, there is a considerable amount of work being done to investigate the boarding school era, to take a look at the impacts and effects that those 357 schools had on hundreds of thousands of Indigenous children during the boarding school era beginning in 1870. To this day, only 81 of the 357 schools have any records. And of those 81 records, they only account for 68,000 youth. So think for a second how many youth, how many children went unaccounted for. So in this forced removal of children, it was a crime to defend your children. It was a crime, and you would be arrested or punished from stopping your children being taken. And in 2022, we would call this trafficking. We would call it child trafficking. We would call it kidnapping. It was a crime to defend. How do you parent if you don't have children to parent? And so where does thousands of years of perfected child-rearing practices go if for nearly 3 generations your parenting is impacted? So we have these diminished customs for child-rearing practices, a loss of puberty ceremonies, a loss of naming ceremonies that are so vital and important to identity. Also unresolved grief and loss. Here we have another round of immense loss. Parents grieving their children, children not returning back to their parents, children dying in boarding schools in large, children dying in boarding schools at unprecedented numbers. So here's the single narrative. Indian children are possessions. Indian parents hold no Western value. These are our property. So the lethality of boarding school era is immense, felt today in our family systems. there is this sort of chronic belief that well, there is a very misguided belief, I think, that gets reinforced year after year after year that Columbus discovered America. That happened in 1492. Indigenous people have had a lot of time to get over their history, so just get over it. But my grandparents, my great aunts were boarding school victims. In my lifetime, I knew them, I hugged them, I loved them. They raised my parents with immense amount of unresolved trauma from those boarding schools experiences. So this childhood experience of all of our Indigenous youth during the boarding school era, it fractured their souls. That's probably the only way that I can describe that, in that they were receiving military style education from very young ages of like 3 years old. And this is happening during those formative years, like they say, like 0 to 10 are these like formative years where your mind and your brain is doing this immense amount of growth. This is how children can take on languages, they can walk, they get into gymnastics. This is, in present time, this is how like a 2-year-old can operate an iPhone. It's because their mind is just doing this incredible amount of growth. So they were really wise in how they sought out these boarding schools and taking children during these formative years. And so the abuse rates here were huge. Mass amounts of sexual abuse, physical abuse, mental abuse, and spiritual abuse. Because there is no oversight. People have free will of children in boarding schools. And what we understand about unresolved trauma is that hurt people hurt people. So then generations of boarding school impacts went on to breed inside of our Indigenous communities. High death rates due to failure to thrive. So just that lack of attention, that lack of love and caring. Chemawa Indian School, just right outside of Salem, Oregon, has a large grave site, 220 marked graves at that school of Indian children who never made it home to see their parents. Parents never knew what happened to them. So today we have what we call living survivors of boarding school. This wasn't history that happened a long time ago. Another interesting thing in the lethality of boarding school is education inequity. Oppression in the education system was developed early on, in that at the turn of the century, it was no longer as easy to force remove children in the manner they were initially taken, where a wagon would come into a reservation and you were forced to put your children on that wagon. But as Indians developed the right to vote in America in 1924, and we were developing some rights and advocacy, it was no longer as easy to use that method. So they became institutions, they became junior colleges, they became trade schools. But we weren't learning how to become doctors and lawyers and teachers. We were learning how to become seamstresses. We were learning how to become auto mechanics. So that education inequity was happening early on. And so at the height of the most devastating years of the boarding school era, in just right at the turn of the century in 1899, this is almost 30 years after the boarding schools were developed. So they'd been running about 30 years before there was any oversight from the federal government. And the U.S. Indian Inspection Team was developed, and they went out to start taking a look at the impacts of these boarding schools, what is happening to children. And this is a quote from William McConnell. He was a U.S. Indian Inspection agent that was dispatched out to take a look at the boarding schools. And he says, "We are little less than murderers if we follow the course we are now following after the attention of those in charge has been called to its fatal results. So some advocacy there 30 years later after children had already suffered immensely. So once the boarding school era technically came to an end, and now these schools were being seen as great institutions, and these trade schools that Indigenous people could then choose to go to. The United States government is going to enter into what they call self-governance period. 104 years since first contact for the Klamath, Modoc, and Yahuskin people. And self-governance is the government's way of saying, well, you've been dependent on us in these reservations. You do have some resources inside of your reservation. We're going to go ahead and allow you to model your governance after the American government. You cannot use your own traditional forms of leadership that have worked for your people for thousands of years. You have to model your government after the American government system. So you can develop your own constitution. You can develop a voting process, and you can, to a degree, manage your own internal affairs with the oversight of several federal agencies. And in this time from 1930s to the 1950s, the Klamath Tribes, carrying a little over 100 years of unresolved and traumatic historical trauma, they brought themselves into becoming the second wealthiest, self-sufficient nation. They brought themselves into becoming the wealthiest, most self-sufficient tribe in the nation in just a little over 20 years. So coming from full dependence on the government to becoming entirely self-sufficient. And with self-sufficiency is freedom. You are making your own resources. You are able to provide income to your members. You are able to manage your own land. And the way that they did this primarily was a gift that was given to the Klamath people by the Creator. In one of our creation stories, it talks about the Creator and how when he was making the world, he gave particular gifts to the Klamath people. Not the Modoc people, not the Yahuskin people, but he placed these medicines in Klamath territory, and that would be the pine tree, the ponderosa pine. And in Klamath territory, you would find the largest, most unique stand of ponderosa pine anywhere in the world. And they use that timber resource as their foundation for self-sufficiency. There's towns popping up all around us. So timber industry was huge for the tribes. They managed their own cattle grazing operations. Their members got a few $100s each quarter that they could manage and live off of, and there was little to no state dependence during this time. So that was a beautiful time. Self-governance was an amazing time for the population. I look at analogies are, I think, really helpful in learning, in that when we take a look at all of these strategies to take from, conquer, and control Indian people, I see these strategies as like tidal waves. This tidal wave comes in and the waves crash down, and it's like, the people are drowning and they're fighting their way back to the top to catch a breath of air. And then here comes the next wave, and they fight and scratch their way to the top. And then here comes the next wave, and the next wave, and the next wave, and the next wave. And then you get to self-governance, and it's literally like you broke away, you swam, you broke away and you literally swim the Pacific Ocean, you get out on the shore and you say, is this what you wanted from it? Is this what you're asking us to do? Because not only did we exceed, we far exceeded it. And the government will take a look at self-governance and say, that was interesting. Okay, what that taught us was we don't always want to do business with sovereign Indian nations. We don't always want to honor treaties. And they quickly went into, in the mid 50s into the 70s, what is known as the termination era. And they began quickly passing statutes. Congress quickly went to work issuing termination statutes, and they collectively terminated 109 federally recognized tribes. Coming in, saying you're terminated, we're removing your land base, we may or may not pay you. From here on out, you are a normal U.S. citizen with no land base and no ability to call yourself a federally recognized tribal member. And then they turned their focus to the Klamath Tribes. And they developed the Termination Act, which was Public Law 587, and they came specifically for the Klamath, Modoc, and Yahuskin people. This would break the Treaty of 1864. This would end supervision of the land, and most importantly, this would end any federal run resource given to the Klamath and Modoc Yahuskin people. Education, social services, and health care. The single narrative will live to say that the Klamath people sold out. They sold their land, and that is not true. The Klamath people didn't vote on the congressional floor in regards to the Klamath Termination Act. Congress voted on the termination bill even after Klamath tribal members went to Washington, D.C. repeatedly and valiantly fighting against termination, knowing that it would be devastating, knowing that the impact would be long felt, but Congress voted to terminate the Klamath tribes. And the only real choice, if you can even describe it as that, was how they were going to start coming off of the tribal role. At the end of the day, everybody would be terminated. And you could either accept a cash payment, or if you were under 18, your money went into a trust fund that would later be grossly mismanaged. Or you could hold out, live on the remaining small portion of land, and hold out for what may or may never come. So there are no folks coming from Washington, D.C. To do a study to really understand what the impact and effect of this is going to have on the Klamath, Modoc, and Yahuskin people. These decisions were left up to family members in their living rooms, trying to wrap their mind around what this act actually meant, what the vote actually meant. And when the vote came out, 80% disenrolled immediately and accepted that first payment. So socially, what does that do to the tribe between the 20% and the 80%? And what happens when you lose everything? Even your hard work is taken. Even your success is taken from you. And even your identity is taken from you. We would later call this the Holocaust of the Klamath tribes. And the lethality of termination and the ripple effects of termination are well alive in 2022. During that termination era, which is roughly 1966 to 1980, so when the payment came out, in 1966, when there was a study done in the 1980s on the impacts and effects of that bill and what happened to the Klamath and Yuhuskin people after termination. The studies showed that 28% of the Klamath Tribes population died by the age of 25. Over a quarter of the population died by the age of 25. 52% died by the age of 40. 40% of all of those deaths were alcohol related. Infant mortality was 2.5 times higher than the state average. And at the end of termination, 70% of the adults had less than a high school diploma. And poverty would be 3 times that of non-Indians in Klamath County. And when we talk about equity, health equity, the Klamath people, Klamath and Yuhuskin people, would lose their health care in 1966 and would not regain it for nearly 30 years. So as they're reeling from all of this trauma, as this eruption of historical trauma bubbles to the surface, contemporary trauma bubbles to the surface, this is literally the birthplace of alcoholism, violence, child neglect, drug abuse, social dysfunction, incarceration. All of these things would be birthed in that period of termination. It was just a whirlpool of trauma in our community, a trauma response in our community. And so the Geneva Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide happened in 1959. And the Geneva Convention was looking at indigenous populations and how they were earmarked for genocide. So this work was happening almost around the same time as Congress was introducing these bills for termination. And they came up with a definition of genocide, and that genocide had to include these markers in order for it to be considered genocidal tactics or genocide. So number 1, killing members of the group. Indian wars. 2, causing seriously bodily or mental harm to members of the group. Indian wars, boarding school. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Indian wars, boarding school era, loss of traditional foods, dependent on the government system, lack of traditional resources, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. In the 1940s, the government approved a strategy to start sterilizing Native American girls in the boarding school systems, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Boarding school trauma. So we know genocide is a real thing. We know that we are victims of survivors, but also we know that we are victims of genocide, but we're also survivors of genocide. So the whole notion of that happened a long time ago, just get over it, is impossible. It's impossible because of the science of trauma. Through fascinating and new brain research science such as epigenetics. And epigenetics is the study of your gene expression and how your gene expression can be traced back and connected to the chronic stressors of your ancestors, generations back. So even though I didn't live in a time of Indian war, I didn't live in a time where I saw my leaders being hung, I didn't live in a time when I watched my brothers and sisters be taken from me, or I wasn't alongside my brothers and sisters in boarding schools that were military ran. I have the genetic code inside of me that shows I'm impacted by that chronic stress. So then I'm more susceptible to disease. I'm more susceptible to depression, to suicide. My genetics are coded for substance abuse and addiction. I have the indicators and markers in my genetic code that are fractured because of the traumatic, chronic, stressful events that my ancestors lived under since pre-contact. So the science of trauma reinforces that the things that happen to us affect us today. And it is not a matter of I can wake up today and I can walk on past who I am, because this is literally embedded in my genetic code. It's like as an example, I work in our behavioral health program. And when 5 o'clock hits and I walk out the door, I don't get to walk away from historical trauma. I don't get to walk away from substance abuse. I don't get to walk away from dysfunctional, chaotic family systems. I'm from the community I serve. I'm inclusive of the community that I serve. I'm from the generations of people that they're from. And so just being Indian, just living Indian, you wake up on the banks of the raging river every day, continually trying to figure out how to cross it. And so the science of trauma is important when we look at this history through a behavioral health lens. I think it is incredibly important to preface history not only from a point of view of harsh, unimaginable, traumatic experiences, inequity, social injustice, oppression, but also to look at how is it that I am standing here today? How is it that we lived on? How is it that our people continue to put one step in front of the other when every odd was against us? And I look at the 1980s as this period of significant resurgence and the beginning of restoration for the Klamath, Modoc, and Yahuskin people. We had major Supreme Court level decision making happening in favor of Klamath Tribal members. So Kimball versus Callahan. This was Chuck Kimball, a Klamath Indian, went up against Callahan in this Supreme Court case to fight for the hunting, fishing, and gathering rights of Klamath, Modoc, and Yahuskin people when there was no reservation. Won that court case and got the hunting, fishing, and gathering rights reinstated. So even though we did not have a land base, you could go on to the treaty boundaries, within the treaty boundaries, and you could hunt and gather and fish for your traditional foods. Now, how good would have that have felt to be without those things, for 25, 30 years? Edison Chiloquin was in the World War II and returned home to liquidation of lands. His mother voted to keep him on the tribal roll. And when his payment came in the 80s, he refused to pick up his payment. And he would light a fire on the banks of Sprague River just over Chiloquin Ridge. And him and his wife would keep that fire burning 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 5.5 years, praying, fighting against the United States government for return of their ancestral land. And in 1980, before Jimmy Carter left presidency, he signed into law the Chiloquin Act, which gave Edison Chiloquin and his family the rights to 580 acres of ancestral land along the Sprague River. So one war-traumatized teenage veteran living on the streets of Chiloquin as a homeless young man, turning to alcohol to treat his PTSD, used cultural ties and sobriety to get the President of the United States to click his pen in his favor. And then you had Klamath Alcohol and Drug Abuse. This was a grassroots behavioral health program. So our first taste of behavioral health since termination imploded on the Klamath people. And this was various Klamath, Modoc, and Paiute Indians who were in various stages of sobriety that decided to just start meeting. Let's start talking about how many loved ones we've buried. Let's start talking about how much destruction there's been and what are we going to do about it. And they started to bring in elements of culture. They figured out how to become substance treatment counselors, and they went to work helping their people out of the trenches. And that program went on to live for 30 plus years, serving Klamath Indians. Beautiful program. Awesome example. And then you had the Indian Religious Freedom Act, which is actually a federal law. So in up until 1978, it was still illegal, federally illegal through law, that Indians practice any of their ceremonies. And that was a law that was birthed during the reservation period when they were attempting to stop Indigenous people from practicing ceremonies within the reservation system. And so Al Smith was a Klamath Indian fired from his place of employment for attending a ceremony. And through his advocacy and his work, the Indian Religious Freedom Act was bolstered and protected tribal ceremonies with the same protections as secular religious proceedings. And the same groups were kind of flowing in and out. The same individuals were flowing in and out of all of those processes and those groups of people and the ceremonies. And they began to talk about going for restoration. In the early 80s, the United States government started to recognize that termination was a failed policy, that it did so much damage to so many tribes that it was not the right decision. And so they were considering tribes for restoration. And the Klamath Tribes introduced into law the Public Law 99-398, which is the Klamath Tribes Restoration Act. And that came before Congress, and Congress voted in for the Klamath Tribes Restoration, which gave them federal recognition. It gave them the ability to develop a self-sufficiency plan. But the Klamath Tribes would be landless. The government would say, we paid you for that land, even though it was pennies on the dollar, even though we had lost so much of our land in backhanded deals, and even from losing land during so the government would say, you're landless. We paid you for that land, even though it was pennies on the dollar, even though there were a lot of backhanded deals that shaved off large amounts of land for the people, even traced back as far as the Treaty of 1864, and how that treaty, was formed over the course of 8 years without anybody being there to watch the process. And so, here we are today. Those of you who are sitting in this training today, you're going into the education system to build a career. Maybe you're going to stay and work here in Klamath County in the field that you're going into. You're going to be part of a community that has a sovereign nation living inside of it. And that is no minor detail. So we're all then collectively on this long social, cultural, spiritual, economical healing process that you get to be a part of as a citizen living on the traditional homelands of the Klamath, Modoc, and Yuhuskin people. In this work that we do, when I walk through the doors of our behavioral health program, I come to work every day defining the it for my people. There was 160 years of chronic stress and trauma from 1826 to 1986. Stacked on top of that is 35 years of contemporary impacts and effects of that chronic stress and trauma. So there is a lot to heal. And every day I come to work, I have to define the it. What is it that my people are trying to heal from? How big is it? How deep is it? And important questions to ask in the process of defining the it, of doing direct service work, is how do we measure, not only myself, but how do you measure the depth of perceived losses? What should we expect from Indigenous people? What is safe to assume about their experiences? And most importantly, is who is responsible for writing this history. The Klamath Tribes at present is fully invested in reviving their identity and reigniting their cultural practices, in maintaining a deep bond and connection to their homeland. Our stories, our ancient stories say this place was created for the mucklucks. This place was created for the Numu. And so that restoration is only getting stronger and stronger. Our connection to our homelands is only going to get deeper and deeper. That will always be the goal of the Klamath Tribes, is to restore those things continually in ourselves, in our families, in our community, and in this county overall. And so this importance of having allies in that process is wise. It's such a wise move to learn this history, because it's where you live, and where we live affects our health. Everything about that is health equity. Where we live and how we feel about where we live and how we are treated in the places that we live affects our health. And history is ours if we want to take ownership of that. If you and your family have lived in this basin for more than 2 generations, this is our history. We have shared history here. And accurate history can be completely healing. We have so many resources at our fingertips that we no longer have to just live off of the dominant narrative. Accurate history is healing. If we can develop an understanding and the way racism is and the way it has influenced our community is wise and important, we are a very diverse community. If we look at ourselves going into healthcare fields, education fields, direct service work fields, then we are helpers and we are healers. And we can use that context to see ourselves as drivers of change, as drivers of truth, as drivers of what's just and what's right. And most importantly, in the work that you do, if the conversation about Indigenous people is on the table, then it should be a nothing about us without us approach. Meaning tribal people should be at the tables. Their voices should be included, because this is the land that we're living on. There are a few points that I want to recap here today, going back to that initial agenda that we had in the beginning is that this is just a peek into historical trauma. This is just a few stories about the Indigenous narrative about our experience here since first contact. You know, if anything you heard today sparked your curiosity, I would expect that you would go out and research. I would expect that you would want to take that curiosity and turn it into a learning experience. You know, today we did our work in diminishing some single narrative that you may have heard growing up here, or you may have seen reinforced in publications and media and just general community discontent. You know, you've heard about where the Klamath Tribes is going and what their hopes and dreams are for their people is to maintain that solid, strong identity and connection to land. And so today, our time together is again about enhancing the meaning and the depth of cultural awareness. To understand that having a sovereign nation living inside Klamath County is no minor detail. And so I wish you the best in your education endeavors, and I look forward to seeing you in the community.